As the situation in Venezuela continues to unfold dramatically day by day, it's becoming even more clear that this is a brazen attempt at a coup by the Trump administration. A lot of updates in this constantly evolving story, but where I really want to start this segment is the news that the US will be imposing new sanctions on the Venezuelan government. Another thing I want to get to in this segment is that the US has officially signed over all Venezuela's assets in US bank accounts, from the Venezuelan president Nicolas Maduro to Guaido, which is an unprecedented move. I'll break that down in a little bit. The sanctions are meant to target Venezuela's state-run oil industry, which accounts for 90% of the government's revenue. Unlike here in the US, where the government gets most of its revenue from taxation, in Venezuela, the government gets 90% of its revenue from selling oil. The sanctions are an attempt to worsen the economic crisis in Venezuela by denying the government the revenue it needs to fund programs and pay government workers. The neocons in the US want further instability in the country so that there's more pressure from the citizens and within his own government for him to step down. They were put in place allegedly because Maduro rigged his recent elections, which I still haven't been convinced of, even though it's been broadcasted throughout mainstream media and on some left-wing independent media outlets online. Do I agree with these sanctions? No. It's the same reason I disagree with most US sanctions. The people who are hurt the most by the sanctions are the poorest people in the country struggling to survive. Every time the US selectively places sanctions on countries, it kills thousands of civilians because they can't get access to food and they can't get access to medicine. So for humanitarian reasons, I'm against it. Also, I don't buy the justification for the sanctions. I mentioned earlier that the US selectively applies sanctions to countries as a political tool. There is no set objective standards in which the response from the US will definitely be to put sanctions on a country if they do X, Y, and Z. What I mean by that is the sanctions are allegedly because Maduro allegedly tampered with his recent elections and the US is trying to restore democracy in Venezuela. If that's the objective standard that we're going with here, where are the sanctions for 73% of the world's dictatorships that the US currently arms and financially backs? It seems like, if you're willing to do business with the United States government, we have no problem overlooking the fact that you arrest and murder your political opponents and political dissidents. I just mentioned the statistic that was recently found that the US currently backs 73% of the world's dictatorships. We also arm and financially back Saudi Arabia, who is in the middle of a genocide in Yemen as we speak. They have an authoritarian theocratic dictatorship in Saudi Arabia. They behead political dissidents on a regular basis. If the US was objectively applying sanctions to human rights violators and people who oppose free and fair elections, it would be hard to skip Saudi Arabia and go straight to sanctioning Venezuela over allegations that have yet to be confirmed. Again, I'm no expert in Venezuelan politics, but as someone who knows a lot about US foreign policy, I can tell you this is straight from the imperialistic playbook of the United States. So again, I don't think the sanctions are effective. I think they cause a lot of harm to innocent people who aren't responsible for the actions of the government, which is the case most of the time when the US imposes sanctions on the country. And also, I just don't buy the bullshit justification as to why we're imposing the sanctions in the first place. The US clearly has other political motives for wanting to see Maduro out of office, and the sanctions are just a means to an end. It's just a tool for the neocons to use to get what they want. Earlier I mentioned that the Trump administration took the unprecedented step of moving all Venezuela's assets in US bank accounts into Guaido's name. This was an extraordinary, unprecedented move. Best case scenario, who's in control of the country is contested right now. In reality, the Venezuelan government backs Maduro. The courts in Venezuela back Maduro. The majority, if not a plurality, of the country is backing Maduro. Clearly, control of the country has not changed, and Maduro is still the acting president and head of the country. But yet the US signed over all of Venezuela's assets to Guaido. This serves more than one purpose for the neocons in the Trump administration. This gives Guaido more leverage and credibility in claiming that he's the new president of Venezuela, because now he has access to all the country's assets in US bank accounts, which is a lot of money. Also, this action is meant to provoke Maduro into some type of retaliation that the US would then use as justification for illegal military intervention in the country. Which brings up the valid question that I'm going to address in a separate segment. That is, whether or not Guaido should be arrested. There is a very serious and credible case to be made that Guaido is actively participating in treason to overthrow the official government of Venezuela. It's no secret that Guaido is in constant contact with the White House and US officials to orchestrate a plan that will overthrow the Venezuelan government. In any other circumstance, no other world leader, past, present, or in the future, would ever allow something like this to stand in their country. You can't have members of the opposition party come out and declare themselves president and then to start make alliances and take policy actions that only the leader of the country can legally take. If any world leader were to allow that, that would mean they'd have absolutely no power and authority in their own country. It's not a matter of cracking down on free speech or political dissidents as much as there needs to be a clear and stated legitimate government in the country, and you cannot have factions pretending that they're the official government of Venezuela or any other country. That will definitely lead to chaos and panic throughout Venezuela or any other country where that situation would be applied. Not to mention that every other Tuesday you'd be inviting a new challenger to try to overthrow your government if there are no consequences for the first time somebody tries to do it. It's a very nuanced discussion and I'm going to do a segment on it later, so subscribe and stay posted for that. Other news on the situation developing in Venezuela. The deadline that the European Union gave Maduro to call for new elections has passed. Now they are officially backing Guaido as the new president of Venezuela, ironically, even though he hasn't been elected to be the Venezuelan president. Which again goes to highlight the hypocrisy of all the foreign actors involved. You claim to be backing Guaido because Maduro allegedly rigged his own election to make himself the president of Venezuela. So in response, you're going to back an illegal coup and overthrow the government and install somebody you just picked to be president who wasn't elected either. I think that this ultimatum to call for a new election was just another bad faith negotiation. It would be incredibly embarrassing and undermine any authority that Maduro has in the country if he caved and abided by this ultimatum provided by the European Union. He just had an election a month ago and isn't due for re-election for another 6 years. If he were to do what they asked of him and set a date for a new election, he'd basically be admitting that he rigged the last election, a claim that has yet to be proven, like I've mentioned multiple times throughout this video. It was an unreasonable demand for the European Union to place on the Venezuelan government to begin with. And like I mentioned, I do believe they did it in bad faith because legally they have no leg to stand on to make such an ultimatum. Up and until this point, no one has proven or provided sufficient evidence that suggests Maduro actually did rig his election. So why would Maduro admit to doing it and then undo it by calling for new elections all within the span of 8 days, when, like I mentioned, no one has proven the claim? I want to wrap this up by saying, every day that passes, it's becoming even more clear that this is without a doubt a U.S. coup to overthrow the Venezuelan government. I'm genuinely baffled that at this late date, anybody's entertaining the idea that this is some type of organic, genuine, grassroots uprising going on in Venezuela as opposed to a brazen coup at the behest of U.S. corporations so that they can steal the natural resources in Venezuela. Because as I continue to mention, Venezuela has the largest oil reserves on the planet, and the U.S. is known for starting wars for oil.